They expected torture, starvation, death. But when Japanese soldiers awoke in American captivity, they found clean beds, hot coffee, and men who treated them like equals. For them, it wasn't comfort. It was confusion, because mercy was the one thing their war had never prepared them for. In this documentary, you'll step inside the camps Japan called luxury prisons. You'll see how these camps were built to break propaganda, not bodies. The cultural shock that shattered Japan's warrior code, and the hidden letters that revealed what those prisoners really thought. Stay with this story, because what they saw behind the wire changed how nations fought wars forever. Tokyo Bay, September 1945. The war is over. A gray transport ship cuts through the calm water, its deck lined with gaunt Japanese soldiers returning home from American captivity. They squint at the shoreline, expecting punishment, not freedom. But what they carry isn't just hunger or fatigue, it's confusion. Stories whisper among them. POW camps where men were fed 3 meals a day, where prisoners played baseball, even listened to music. For men taught that capture meant shame and death, it sounded impossible. Unbelievable. The question is, why was it true? To understand that disbelief, you have to start with how Japan and the United States viewed surrender itself. In Imperial Japan, capture was not an option. The Bushido Code, the centuries-old warrior ethic, declared that death was preferable to dishonor. Soldiers were trained to see surrender as the ultimate shame, not just for themselves, but for their families and their emperor. That belief ran deep through the ranks. By 1942, many Japanese troops genuinely thought Allied prisoners were treated like animals, or executed outright. The propaganda told them so. Across the Pacific, the American mindset was almost the opposite. U.S. forces had grown up in a military culture rooted in law and regulation, not ideology. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified by the U.S. but not by Japan, defined how prisoners of war were to be treated. Humane conditions, medical care, correspondence, food equal to the captor's own rations. The U.S. didn't always follow it perfectly, but it believed in the principle. Because in Washington's eyes, how a nation treated its prisoners reflected its civilization. When American forces began capturing Japanese soldiers in early 1942, on Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, later on the Marianas, they faced a strange challenge. The prisoners didn't want to live. Many tried to kill themselves or provoke guards into shooting them. The U.S. military was forced to rethink how to even handle men who believed capture was worse than death. That became the seed of something remarkable. Instead of brutalizing their captives, the Americans leaned into structure and routine. They set up camps not to punish but to process. And as the war dragged on, what emerged behind barbed wire was something few Japanese soldiers could have imagined. A world of discipline, fairness, and even comfort by wartime standards. But to see how this contrast took shape, you have to look closer at what kind of system America built and what kind of system Japan expected. By 1943, the United States was operating dozens of POW camps across its territory, from California and Texas to the plains of Iowa. By the war's end, there would be over 500 camps holding more than 400,000 Axis prisoners, mostly Germans and Italians with smaller groups of Japanese. Each camp ran under the watchful eye of the War Department and the International Red Cross. Inspections were frequent, records meticulous. The U.S. wanted to demonstrate that it was a nation of law, even in war. Inside these camps, prisoners lived in wooden barracks with beds, blankets, electric light, and, crucially, food. 3 meals a day, similar in calories to what U.S. soldiers ate. Medical units treated illness and injury. Chaplains offered religious services. There were libraries, workshops, even orchestras and language classes. Some POWs were sent out to work on farms or in sawmills, paid modest wages they could use at the camp canteen. The goal wasn't kindness, it was control. American officials understood morale and discipline mattered. A well-fed, occupied prisoner caused fewer problems. And in the larger political picture, it sent a message. This is how a civilized power behaves. It also built moral leverage. When Japan's treatment of Allied captives, especially at places like the Burma Railway, Bataan, and Changi, became known, Washington used its own humane record as contrast in the propaganda war. But for Japanese soldiers, the idea of humane captivity simply didn't exist. They'd been taught that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant torture and humiliation. So when Japanese POWs, often wounded and terrified, arrived at U.S. camps and found order, rations, and even recreation, their shock was profound. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down, convinced it was a trick. A few even began to question what else the imperial government had lied about. That cultural collision, Bushido versus bureaucracy, honor versus law, would define how both sides saw the enemy. Next, we'll break down the angles behind that clash. Human, moral, tactical, and psychological, why it mattered so deeply to both nations. For many Japanese soldiers, surrender was never rehearsed, never discussed. They had no vocabulary for captivity. When American guards greeted them with food and water instead of rifles, they hesitated, waiting for the cruelty they'd been promised. What came instead were routines, roll calls, medical checks, camp duties. In some camps, American officers encouraged the Japanese to form self-governing groups to maintain discipline. For men who had expected execution, the simple act of being treated as a human being was disorienting. Some broke down in silence. Others couldn't stop bowing, confused by mercy they didn't understand. Japanese military culture prized self-sacrifice above survival. A soldier who lived after defeat was seen as less than a man. Propaganda films told stories of captured men being dissected alive or paraded as animals. That made surrender psychologically impossible. So when reports circulated of POWs in America playing baseball or studying English, many dismissed them as Allied lies. Even decades later, veterans recalled feeling guilt, not gratitude, for being treated kindly. The camp became a mirror reflecting the collapse of their code, and that realization cut deep. For the U.S., good treatment wasn't purely moral, it was strategic. Humane camps created a propaganda weapon of their own. Photographs of healthy Axis POWs working farms in Texas or playing soccer in Wisconsin helped shape international opinion. It showed the U.S. as civilized, lawful, and restrained. And behind the scenes there was a practical motive. Washington hoped that by treating Axis captives well, American POWs in enemy hands might, at least in theory, be treated better in return. It rarely worked with Japan, but the intent was clear. The U.S. military viewed every camp as both moral theater and logistical necessity. The International Committee of the Red Cross inspected American camps regularly, filing reports that read like audits of small towns. They noted cleanliness, nutrition, and access to communication. POWs could write letters home, sometimes through neutral countries like Switzerland. For Japanese prisoners, those letters were often the first time they admitted being alive. And for the Americans, each inspection validated their approach. War could be brutal, but decency was a weapon too. Each of these perspectives reveals a different truth, but they all orbit one question. How could such comfort exist in a world built on destruction? Running a POW camp wasn't about luxury. It was about efficiency. The U.S. Army saw discipline as order, and order as security. Each camp functioned like a small military town. Guards, supply officers, doctors, and administrators all following strict protocol. Food was standardized, medical logs reviewed weekly, and punishments documented. That precision created stability. The prisoners weren't pampered. They were managed. But compared to the chaos of the Pacific Front, even management felt like comfort. A clean cot and predictable meals could feel like another world. When the Office of War Information realized how Japanese soldiers perceived capture, it saw an opportunity. Leaflets were dropped over Pacific Islands showing smiling POWs eating rice, reading newspapers, or writing home from American camps. The goal wasn't mercy, it was surrender. If even a handful of soldiers laid down arms instead of dying in futile charges, it saved lives and shortened the fight. But for Japan's high command, those images were poison. They undercut decades of indoctrination and risked breaking the illusion of noble death. Propaganda units quickly labeled the photos as fakes. After the war, Japanese officers who visited U.S. camps under Allied supervision could hardly process what they saw. They toured barracks where German prisoners played violins, saw Japanese inmates teaching language classes, and inspected kitchens with rice and miso soup prepared for cultural familiarity. One officer later wrote in disbelief, "Our captives were treated as guests, not enemies." It wasn't admiration he expressed, it was shame. Because if the Americans could follow rules amid global chaos, what did that say about Japan's own humanity during the war? The contrast between the two systems became a quiet indictment. Allied investigations after 1945 revealed the brutality of Japanese-run camps. Starvation, disease, forced labor, and summary executions. When those reports surfaced, the footage of U.S. camps became moral evidence. It wasn't just about who won the war, it was about who upheld civilization under pressure. The Japanese captives' disbelief wasn't misplaced. They were witnessing a completely foreign moral universe. And within that realization lay the story's turning point, when perception collided with truth, and even hardened soldiers began to question the world they'd fought for. It happened quietly in moments that didn't make the headlines. One of them unfolded at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in late 1944. A transport of newly captured Japanese soldiers, taken during the Mariana Campaign, arrived in heavy coats borrowed from the U.S. Army. Snow fell in slow silence, unlike anything most of them had ever seen. Guards led them to warm barracks, handed out blankets, rice, and even cigarettes. There were no beatings, no interrogations that broke bones, just order. The next morning, the prisoners watched German POWs play soccer on a frozen field. They laughed, shouted, competed, and the guards didn't stop them. To the Japanese, this wasn't captivity. It looked like peace. One officer later recalled in his diary, "We were certain it was a trap. But each day nothing happened. They treated us as men." That disbelief lingered for months. Elsewhere at Camp Trinidad in Colorado, the pattern repeated. Japanese captives worked on farms under supervision, earning small wages, eating fresh fruit they hadn't seen since the war began. The Americans even arranged Buddhist services for them. For soldiers raised to expect execution, such treatment was almost unbearable. Some refused to eat, convinced it was psychological warfare. Others began to write letters, slowly, awkwardly, trying to explain to their families that they were alive, cared for, and confused. Red Cross officials documented these reactions in their reports. One entry noted that Japanese prisoners seemed emotionally disoriented by kindness. Another observed that discipline remains self-imposed, as if they cannot comprehend leniency. And then came the moment that shattered the myth entirely, when a Japanese officer confronted an American guard captain and asked, through a translator, "Why do you not punish us? We killed your men." The American simply replied, "Because the war decides guilt, not me." That sentence, plain and procedural, carried more weight than any sermon. It broke the ideological wall that had separated the two worlds. For the first time, Japanese prisoners began to realize that the Americans weren't performing mercy. They were enforcing principle. And that realization set the stage for the real turning point. When those same men began to question the empire that had told them mercy was weakness. By 1945, that realization began spreading, quietly, camp to camp. Japanese POWs, once silent and withdrawn, started forming study groups. At Camp Kooskia, Idaho, they built gardens and repaired trucks. At Camp Clarinda, Iowa, they published handwritten newsletters in Japanese discussing world events they were never meant to know. For the first time, they read about Hiroshima and Nagasaki from American newspapers, not from Tokyo propaganda. The empire they had died for was gone, and the people they were told were monsters were showing restraint, even dignity. That dissonance was profound. Many struggled with guilt, not for what they had done, but for what they had believed. One prisoner later said, "I thought America was a land of devils. Then I saw they followed rules even when no one watched." American commanders recognized this psychological shift. The War Department's Prisoner of War Division began recording attitude changes, noting that Japanese prisoners who once refused all orders now volunteered for work details, learned English, or requested books on democracy. None of this was sentimental, it was administrative. But in the process, the U.S. was conducting an unintentional experiment in re-education, defeating militarism not with propaganda, but with consistency. The climax of that change came at the end of the war. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American camps erupted with mixed emotion. Some prisoners wept, others stood motionless, and a few attempted suicide in despair. Yet most accepted the news with quiet relief. The world that had told them to die with honor was gone, and the world that had treated them with rules still stood. When repatriation began weeks later, ships departed from Seattle, San Francisco, and Honolulu, carrying thousands of Japanese POWs back to their homeland. On board, they were given clean clothes, hot meals, and even medical checks. Red Cross officials described the journeys as solemn but orderly. As the ships neared Japan, many men gathered on deck. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Others stared at the horizon, wondering how their families would see them now. Traitors, survivors, or witnesses to a truth their nation had hidden. They returned not just with scars, but with questions. How could the enemy show compassion when their own leaders hadn't? That question lingered long after the war ended, shaping how an entire generation of veterans understood defeat and humanity itself. When the repatriation ships docked in Japan, the silence was heavier than the fog. Most returning POWs avoided eye contact with the crowds. In the eyes of their homeland, they weren't survivors. They were disgraced men. Families were instructed to receive them without ceremony, neighbors whispered. Some veterans even changed their names to hide the shame of capture. But these men carried something powerful: perspective. They had seen the inside of American camps that, to them, felt more orderly than their own military barracks. They'd seen prisoners treated by medics, fed adequately, and allowed to live without constant fear. The contrast between that reality and the brutal stories of Allied POWs under Japanese control was impossible to ignore. Reports began to circulate quietly among scholars, journalists, and occupation officials about how differently each side had handled captives. In Tokyo, U.S. investigators working for the Allied occupation compiled testimony from returning Japanese POWs. Some confessed confusion. Others spoke with awe. One officer described an American camp as a small town of fairness. Another said he realized we were the barbarians, not them. Those words never made it to Japan's newspapers. The government, under Allied supervision, still feared public reaction. But among the prisoners themselves, something began to shift. Many joined post-war reconstruction efforts. Some worked as translators for the occupation forces, and others became outspoken pacifists, men who had lived on both sides of mercy. Meanwhile, in the United States, the POW system that had astonished them was already being dismantled. By late 1946, most of the camps had closed. The barracks were converted to housing or farmland. To Americans, it was administrative closure. To the Japanese who had lived there, it was the end of a strange, paradoxical peace. But the real consequence of those camps wasn't in wood or wire. It was in the quiet transformation of those who passed through them. In the years that followed, fragments of that experience began resurfacing in unexpected ways. When the U.S. occupation government encouraged democratic reforms in Japan, some of the earliest supporters were former POWs. They had seen firsthand a system where authority was bound by law, not personality, where soldiers questioned orders without fear of execution. For men once shaped by blind obedience, that was revolutionary. Others carried more personal scars. Many refused to speak about their captivity for decades, afraid their families would reject them again. Yet as Japan's post-war generation began asking what the war had truly cost, those stories found new meaning. Memoirs and oral histories emerged in the 1960s and 70s, describing the surreal reality of American camps, of Christmas dinners with guards, English lessons, and even baseball games under the shadow of barbed wire. To the younger generation, those accounts didn't sound shameful. They sounded human. Historians later realized those camps had done something subtle but lasting. They had preserved a record of moral restraint in an age of total war. The U.S. wasn't perfect. Mistreatment occurred, and racism was real. But compared to the cruelty elsewhere in the Pacific, the American approach stood out as deliberate, almost philosophical. For Washington, the lesson became part of Cold War identity, moral power through conduct. For Japan, it became a quiet reminder of how ideology can blind a nation to basic humanity. And for the men who had lived it, the memory of those camps stayed clear long after the war's noise faded, not because they were luxurious, but because they revealed that mercy could survive even inside a system built for war. As the last of those prisoners aged into silence, their recollections remained the final evidence of an unlikely truth. Sometimes dignity leaves a deeper mark than victory. History often remembers who won and who lost, but rarely how they behaved. For the Japanese soldiers who once believed capture meant shame, the American POW camps became a strange kind of mirror. Inside those fences, they saw a version of the enemy that refused to mirror their own cruelty. That quiet civility, rules, fairness, restraint spoke louder than propaganda ever could. It didn't erase the war's horrors or the atrocities committed on either side, but it proved something enduring, that power and principle can coexist even in the ugliest conditions imaginable. The Americans built those camps not as sanctuaries, but as proof of what separated them from the world they were fighting. And for the men who returned home carrying that memory, the experience became a lifetime reminder that honor isn't defined by death or conquest. It's defined by how one treats the powerless. The war ended. The fences came down and the world moved on. But in the stillness of those camps, between the rules and the rations, between mercy and discipline, something quietly human survived. And that, more than any weapon, was the real victory. In the end, it wasn't the bombs or the battles that broke them. It was mercy. Behind the fences of those American camps, they discovered a truth their empire had buried, that dignity could survive even in captivity. Remember their story. Because history only fades when we stop telling it. Subscribe, share, and keep the memory alive. The war ended long ago, but the silence of those who saw both sides still echoes, waiting to be heard.